Thank you and welcome to everybody. This is another in our Radix webinars, which are becoming very regular. We've had some really exciting guests already this year. We've got Julia Hobsbawm joining us towards the end of the month, and I'll say a bit more about that at the end of the talk. But today we are delighted to welcome Sir John Kay, who has many, many eminent roles, but none more eminent than being a Radix Fellow, of course. And so we are really delighted to have him with us. I'm not going to introduce him. I will introduce Vicky, who is our Chair of Fellows. Many of you will have seen her in her Radix space before. And Radix, Vicky, and who is one of the country's sort of leading economists and economic commentators, will be talking to John. Just before they kick off, we were particularly keen to address this subject because Radix, which focuses, as many people know, on system change, has been running a project called New Capital Consensus, which is looking at the investment system and is really focused on how we release more money from our investment system for more productive capital for productive investment. And so this begins to reflect on that. And I know that John is going to comment on the work of New Capital Consensus. If you're interested in that, please do check out our website, radixuk.org. We launched our first report about 2 weeks ago, and you'll find it there and some commentary on it. With those words, I'm going to hand over to Vicky, who is going to spend the next hour finding out about John's latest book. Over to you, Vicky.
Well, thank you, Ben. And it's great to have John with us today. It's a postponed meeting. We were going to speak to John a few months ago, but he's now well and able to do this today after an accident that you'll probably know about, those who know John well. So he's fit and everything is absolutely fine. And his book is really, really great as well, The Corporation in the 21st Century. And interestingly enough, I've known John for quite some time. And when he couldn't come to some event, I actually stood in alongside Mervyn King and others talking about his book. So in his absence, we just spent an entire evening debating his book. Quite a lot of very senior people, including Matthew Oakeshott, and as I said, Mervyn King, with whom John, of course, has written another book as well, which is called Radical Uncertainty. They're talking about John's book. So, John is well known to many of you already anyway. He's, of course, Sir John Kay now, in recognition of his contribution to economics. And I've known him not only as an economist, simply because our paths crossed a number of times, but also he was, of course, the head of a very, very successful company called London Economics, which he started himself alongside another associate. And at some point during the life of London Economics, which is still there, of course, I worked at London Economics myself. So we had some interactions in that area too, which was great. Of course, John is an academic up to a point, because of course he has worked very much in business. And the interesting thing about what he does is that he brings together his knowledge and understanding of economics to how businesses operate. And of course, he was also Dean of the Said Business School in Oxford for 3 years. And what has been the result of all this, of course, and this sort of mix of knowledge, is the publication of a number of books that look quite carefully at sort of industrial structures, how companies operate, the competitive advantage of firms, and how to get there. So there is really an interesting mix of business strategy and public policy, which comes out very, very strongly through his books. And it is a real pleasure and privilege to have John with us this evening. What I discussed with John originally was that maybe he could do a up to 10 minutes introduction about his latest book, which of course has the subtitle of why almost, in inverted commas, and I wouldn't mind knowing what the almost is. In other words, what is it that still that we knew about business, which is now right? Because the subtitle is why almost everything we are told about business is wrong. As John speaks, I will be collecting some of the questions that have already been sent to us through Eventbrite, and others that have been sent to me because some people found sending questions to Eventbrite for some reason difficult, even though it's normally quite simple. Perhaps they decided to bypass the system. But do add more questions, please, in the chat room that we've got open for you. So, John, over to you.
Well, thanks, Vicky. And we've been, as you've described, we've worked together for quite a long time. So a lot of what I have to say will already be familiar to you, but I hope it will become more familiar to the audience as we go through the evening. Let me begin by saying that many of you will have recently been on an aeroplane. And you probably thought when you went on the plane that the airline whose logo was painted on the fuselage owned the plane. It almost certainly doesn't. The largest owner of civil aircraft in the world is a company called AerCap, based in Dublin, of which most people have never heard, and most aircraft are actually owned by leasing organizations and leased. In fact, I myself own a very small share in a company which owns an Airbus, which is leased to Emirates and derives reliable revenue from that. However, the company that owns the aeroplane almost certainly doesn't own the engines of the aeroplane, because what an airline does is it contracts with one of the major aircraft engine producers, like Rolls-Royce, Pratt& Whitney, General Electric, and it buys typically 10 years of air engine services. That means that the company promises to provide an engine, a functioning engine for the plane for 10 years. It might not be the same engine. It might change the engine in the course of the contract. But that's the agreement that is made. And of course, Rolls-Royce may make the contract to supply the aircraft, the aero engine, but it doesn't actually own the aero engine. The ownership of the engine is almost certainly passed on to some subsidiary company with other shareholders, and so on. The idea I want to get across is that the notion we have to rethink the way capital is used in business and the role that capital plays. One thing that is certain is that the airline is not controlled by the people who are supplying the equipment, the plane, the engines, etc. That in fact, what the airline is doing is buying these services in the same way as it buys electricity and water and all the other things which are necessary to run a business nowadays. So that we need to think of capital as a service, which people buy in the same way they buy, or firms buy in the same way as they buy other services. And more than that, we need to understand that the modern company is typically a collection of capabilities. It's not in the way it was 200 years ago, the way it was even 100 years ago, or actually mostly 50 years ago. The company is not the place where people go in order to do the work, or it doesn't control the plant to which people go. If we'd been talking 100 years ago, we'd have been talking about Henry Ford's Dearborn plant that made automobiles. It was probably the largest industrial plant in the world at the time. You could put Manhattan in it many times and still have room left. It was probably not just the largest plant in the world. It was probably the largest plant there ever will be, because business isn't like that anymore. Business is a collection of capabilities, not the product of some kind of capital. And that means we keep using this word entrepreneur, I think in a rather misleading way. If you look back at the French, entrepreneur means the person who brings things together. And that's actually what happens in modern business. A modern business is defined by a collection of capabilities. So that if we think of Apple, for example, or Amazon, which are archetypes of modern corporations, Apple products are designed in California. You can read that on the box. That's pretty much all that happens in California. And the largest assembler of Apple products is a company called Foxconn, which is owned by a Taiwanese company called On High Industries, though Foxconn actually accounts for quite a small proportion of the value of the iPhone, typically $20 and a $500 product. The largest supplier of parts for the iPhone is actually Samsung, which in turn is Amazon's principal rival. If you go into the Apple store in Regent Street, you will see the term Apple everywhere. You probably don't know that that building is it's jointly owned by the King and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. That's the nature of capital ownership in the modern economy. And one thing we can say for sure is that neither the King nor the Norwegians control Apple. Apple is controlled, as it has been all the time, by its professional management. So that entrepreneurship is the bringing together of capabilities to produce products, innovative products. It's not just Apple is a collection of capabilities, but actually the iconic product, the iPhone, is a collection of capabilities. The iPhone replaces a phone, a map, a Mac, a library, a record player, and a whole variety of things, which interestingly would have occupied 10 times the volume and 10 times the space that the iPhone that fits in your pocket actually does. So that this world of business has changed fundamentally from the world of the Industrial Revolution, in which rich people built steel works and textile mills, and they attracted relatively low-skilled workers from the fields in order to man, or in the case of the textile mills, typically woman, these plants. That's what business once was like. Business is not like that anymore. The iPhone costs $500 a kilo. The probably most valuable currently manufactured product is the Pfizer mRNA vaccine against COVID-19, which per kilo is 10 times more valuable than gold. But of course, it's not the stuff you're buying, or only in a very narrow sense is it the stuff. What you're buying is the intellectual capabilities that went into it. That is typically the nature of modern business. And the iPhone and the COVID vaccine, and very different types of products, are in this sense characteristic of modern business and modern business products. The value doesn't lie in the stuff, the value that lies in the ideas that go into it. Now, the overriding theme of my book, The Corporation in the 21st Century, is to say that we're still using the language of the Industrial Revolution, even to describe products and businesses that have changed completely. Products have dematerialized, production has dematerialized. The value of modern products is intellectual, not physical. And nevertheless, we still find we're talking, when we do Economics 101, we see production functions in which you write output is a function of K and L, where K is capital and L is labor. And if our instructor is very sophisticated, he will introduce a term for technical progress before you have F, K, and L. Similarly, if you go to the politics class, you will be told that business is polarized between capital and labor, the same division into two capabilities. That is true of the mathematical representation. But this doesn't describe modern business at all. Modern business is a collection of people working together to use accumulated knowledge to produce new products and develop new ideas for them. And that's how it is that both in the case of pharmaceuticals and in the case of smartphones, we're getting new products certainly every day, every year. Modern business is in this sense very different. Everything has changed since the Industrial Revolution. The language we use to talk about it has not. And what I hope you will find in my book is some of the language we should be using to describe business as it really is today.
Well, thank you, John. That's great. There are already questions coming in, but I did want to pick you up on a few things. I mean, you said that, of course, whoever owns the plane, I mean, we think that the particular company may be owning the plane and run the whole thing, but of course, it could be owned by the company that has leased it to the airline, etc., etc. And in terms of where production is done, it is, of course, spread across the world. Does this mean that at the end of the day, you can't hold the company itself responsible for the way it operates? Let's say it's Apple or Amazon or Meta or anyone else like that, because there are a collection of other things that are happening and coming into their organization? Or can we still hold them to account because they are the ones who are controlling their supply chain? And I think that's quite important, because you do devote quite a large part in the book on, on social values and proper ethical behavior, which of course is supposed to be good for business. But we've seen lots of examples of these types of companies that I mentioned perhaps not doing the right thing. So how do we now interpret who, if you like, to blame or who to focus our attention on?
I think once we've identified that the company is the collection of capabilities, it's the people who put that collection of capabilities together.
The management, in other words, at the top.
Yes. So as far as I'm concerned, understanding modern business is about understanding modern management. And what happened really across the 20th century was that in the first half of that century, you got the attempt to create an activity of professional management, the kind of thing that went on in companies like ICI in Britain, General Motors in the US, General Electric, and so on. And that was creating an activity of professional management. And the people around these companies were perfectly clear that that was what they were doing. One thing I talk about at some length in the book, and there's even more to be said about that, is the way in which that professional management was eroded in the latter decades of the 20th century, in large part by the rise of the so-called shareholder value movement that said the purpose of business was not, as it was for General Motors or ICI, to serve a whole variety of stakeholders. The purpose of business was to make money for shareholders. And as an important subsidiary to that, it was to make money for the people who were actually running the company. So that actually gave rise to what we now recognize as the bonus culture. And the paradox that I was describing, which is in the Industrial Revolution, it was the rich people who built plants and controlled business. Today, people who control business are, again, very wealthy, but they're very wealthy because they control business. No, they don't control business because they're very wealthy.
Well, it's interesting because I do remember when I was working for the government, you also did a review working alongside the Department for Business and others at the time on restricting, if you like, what banks can do in terms of also using their own resources or financial institutions to enrich themselves in various areas. So would you then, although I'm not sure you mentioned bankers' bonuses in the book, or perhaps you do, Are you against this the move away from putting a fixed cap on the percentage of pay that could go as bonuses for bankers, which the previous Conservative government lifted, and the Labour government seems to have accepted that is to stay as the Conservatives have deemed.
Yeah, I think the idea that people should be paid large bonuses for their contribution to creating shareholder value is the product of a fundamentally dysfunctional culture. I remember when I was teaching at London Business School, in fact, I brought to talk to a class of mine someone was a retired chief executive of one of the major archetypal British companies of the 20th century. And at the end of it, he said quietly to me, you know, these kids regard being CEO as a prize, not a responsibility. And that encapsulated for me a change that has happened, and a change not for the better.
Yeah.
Because
has it changed at all? Because you do talk quite a lot here about, you know, the business case for corporate social responsibility, if you want to call it that, is really quite strong. But here we are, people moving away from this, moving away from ESG, moving away even from diversity and inclusion issues. All that, is that worrying you in terms of, you know, looking at, is there a resurgence of going back again to the shareholder value and transactional perspective that we see developing, not just in companies, but also in countries like the US?
I'm glad we're moving away from the CSG, ESG, CSR, DEI kind of obsession. What I see has happened has been there is an underlying strong current of hostility to business, particularly in part of intellectuals like ourselves. And that was met in the shareholder value era by people developing the CSR, ESG kind of agenda, picking up the environmental issues, the identity issues that attracted these kind of intellectuals, but didn't have anything very much to do with business, actually, the proper conduct of business. You could appoint an ethics department to deal with this. And that was driven home to me by another striking example. I've talked quite often, when I talk negatively about the shareholder value world, I've talked often about the decline of ICI. And I've contrasted what was ICI's mission statement for the decades in which it was Britain's most successful industrial companies, which was to say that the business of ICI is the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences to business. And it went on, through achievement of our aim, we will provide products, employment, tax revenues, profits, and everything else. That was what they used to say. Then they said ICI is here to create shareholder value by focusing on businesses in which we have a competitive advantage. Two interesting things. One was that the first company lasted 80 years, 70 years. The second company basically lasted 15. The people who created shareholder value succeeded in destroying shareholder value on a large scale. That's really important. And if I go back to the aviation industry, what's astonishing is that I can tell exactly the same story about Boeing. But there's a twist to the story, which is said way back in 2006, I gave a talk and made ICI and what had happened to ICI a highlight. And a few days later, I got a pained letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. What it said, to paraphrase only roughly, was that we might have screwed up the business, but we did a great job on corporate social responsibility. And I thought, you have so little idea of what corporate social responsibility is actually about.
Well, I mean, that's interesting. It's really how you define what corporate social responsibility is about, which I think is what you're right. Simply ticking boxes and greenwashing or whatever doesn't do it. But a lot of what you say in the book does suggest that the value of a company increases quite significantly if you look at the way in which you put things together and you take social value of whatever it is that your company is in, or enhancing that social value, quite seriously. So in other words, not with gimmicks, but with action. And I think one of the things that worries me in your definition of a new company, which of course it's correct, of today, is that there are loads of supply chains where companies that are producing various things for you may not be following the principles you want to have, even though as a management you're putting it all together at the top. Somehow you could fail along the line, and that can cause you quite a lot of issues, and you could just lose this margin you're making on top, if you like. I don't know whether we want to call it rent or not, because you have quite a lot in the book about economic rent, how it's defined, and perhaps we have misunderstood that one as well through the centuries. But it could actually bring the company down quite quickly. Do you not think that that is an issue right now? We have this big monopolies. Professor Stephen Smith is talking about this. We have this monopoly power that's been set up, which perhaps is for big IT firms in particular in the US, which we have allowed to happen, where there is very, the chance of them really watching what happens down the value chain may be very, very small. So what do you think about that type of development? So big firms not necessarily being on top of what their suppliers are doing.
There's a lot in that, that question raises a lot of issues. Let's go back to that Boeing example I took. Boeing, at the end of the Second World War, Boeing became the world's leading civil aircraft producer. The CEO for most of that time was a man called Bill Allen, who famously said, "We exist to live, sleep, and breathe the world of aeronautics." And that was the Boeing as it was, the Boeing that launched the 737, the 746, the 747, the Boeing that essentially brought air travel to a mass audience. At the end of the 20th century, Boeing had a takeover, had a merger with McDonnell Douglas. The interesting thing about that is that the transaction was legally a takeover by Boeing of McDonnell Douglas, but culturally a takeover by McDonnell Douglas. And McDonnell Douglas had become a company which was very much Wall Street oriented and emphasized shareholder value. Phil Condit, who was one of the became CEO of the merged company when the company moved its head office from Seattle, where it had been through the great decades, to Chicago, said the problem with being located near your production facilities is you get too involved in day-to-day. That says a lot. What says even more was his successor when he was pushed out, said, people say this is a great engineering company. It is a great engineering company, but people invest in a company because they want to make money. And that was the philosophy that became central to Boeing. And the next chief executive was a man called James McNerney, who had been a protege of Jack Welch's, the great guru of shareholder value at General Electric. And McNerney was chief executive while Boeing decided not to produce a new short-haul aircraft to compete with Airbus, but to produce the 737 MAX, which was a revamp essentially of their 737. It was, I think it's just ceased to be, but it was for 80 years the best-selling aircraft in the world. Of course, that place is now taken by Airbus with their 20. But we know what happened with the 737. We know about the crashes in 2018, 2019, the redesign after that. And now we have the farce of the astronauts who are stranded in the space station waiting for Elon Musk to get them.
So this is a worry. But are you therefore saying that actually having production closer to you, where you can keep an eye on it, is considerably better than the way that we have developed the entire sort of production system and through globalization.
May or may not be. You can't generalize in that way. Big businesses are collections of capabilities. Apple, I was saying, is a collection of capabilities. The iPhone is a collection of capabilities. But actually, Apple don't need to be keeping that close an eye on the assembly line of Foxcons. They do need to be monitoring the quality of the product, and they do. On the other hand, and similarly, Airbus, if one takes that example, it was again a collection of the capabilities of European firms, area, which in the end merged into what became a single successful company.
Well, maybe that will happen in the defense sector as well, if we keep our fingers crossed and do it right. But there is a question in the chat, John, which says, from Andy Ross, which says that in what way is your idea of this collection of capabilities, which defines a firm, different from COSA's concept of a firm as a set of contracts shaped by relative transaction costs? So is there any difference? Is that it? Is it very similar, but expressed in a different way?
There's a chapter about that in the book, of course, which examines what's right and wrong and the idea of the firm as a nexus of contracts. But actually, the idea that businesses are defined by the costs of contracting seems to me fundamentally a mistake. Businesses are not collections of contracts. Successful businesses are teams of people working together. And they're working together not because they have a transactional relationship, but because they have a relationship that is social as well as economic. And that's what working in a great business really is like.
Does this mean then, because there is a question also from David Elms here, does this mean that if you're looking at the value of a company, I think you have some examples of the value of Amazon and the value of, there were two of them, Apple, I think. You mentioned Apple already. Of course, that it is so much greater than their assets, and that in some ways proves that it's the capabilities all being brought together and managing them in a certain way that adds this extra value, that it could just very easily collapse if the management changes, as I think you've been describing various firms in the past that are no longer with us. And that is a concern because everyone invests in those companies. They form, to a considerable extent, the sort of indices you follow, pension funds and so on. So does that make us being in a much riskier situation in the capital markets?
I think it could or could not. It depends on the competence of the professional management of the firm. And that was true, that was always true. But I think it's right that if a firm is a collection of capabilities, and the people who are running that don't really understand that, they don't understand that the strength of the organization lies not in the genius of the executives who are running it, but in the ability of the people who work for it together, to work together. One of the things I might have said more in the book, and probably will in some of the things I will write in the future, is to get away from the idea that Carlyle wrote that history is the biography of great men. We have an awful lot that says that business history is the biography of great men, and it really isn't. Business history, or successful business history, is lots of capable people working together as an integrated team.
But do we need to worry, though, about the fact, and again, going back to Stephen Smith's question, that quite a lot of those managers, if you like, those who bring it all together, are also owners, and that we've ended up with a situation of super wealth for them, and also monopoly power in many areas, which they've managed to develop through just increasing this extra value that they manage to extract from the assets that they collect. And it's very, very difficult then to break that. So are we worrying about this as well, that we are ending up with managers or stroke owners basically focusing very much on their own wealth? So It may not be exactly shareholder value as we knew it, but it's something else which perhaps is even more worrying than before.
I think there is a real worry there, and I think the way in which, well, let's take the man in papers at the moment, who's Elon Musk. I think we have to
Yeah.
say, first of all, that Musk is the richest man in the world, not because he's the greediest man in the world, or because he set out to become ultra rich. He set out to do exciting things in space, in vehicles, and so on, and has done them. I mean, he is an extraordinarily talented manager. Uh, the fact that the company he created is now, we should hesitate about this because it's a pretty volatile number, but the fact that he's made 3 billion, how many billion dollars out of it, sorry, 3,000 billion dollars out of it is
Trillion.
ludicrous. Yes. And I think we need to find a way of managing business which avoids these kind of ridiculous enrichments. On the other hand, that is what Musk is doing. What Musk has been doing is creating great businesses. And what that I can tell that story over and over again. That was the Boeing story. That was the General Motors story. That was General Motors and General Electric until more modern managers who were taught about shareholder value screwed it up. I mentioned
Mhm.
that Jack Welch was, well, he was famously declared the manager of the century by Fortune in 1919, in 1999. Well, look at what has happened to General Electric since 1999, and you find it difficult to point to a legacy that says Jack Welch was the manager of the century.
Yes, well, it's interesting that GE, as we remember it, had one of the most brutal ways of getting rid of its employees. So 10% would be of the lowest performing ones would all be struck out, which of course resulted in everyone competing against each other in the most terrible way. And of course, we may be moving to the civil service doing something similar if we believe everything we've heard in the last few days about looking at how they perform. Do you think that in terms of the way you treat people, this is a part that needs to nevertheless be maintained? You talked against ESG in a way, but it does create different types of sort of incentives which are not particularly good. There is one interesting comment in the chat, if I can find it now, which says that they've never met an MBA person who isn't selfish or a banker who talks at all about stakeholder management rather than shareholder management. So is it the culture in the organizations, particularly those very big ones, that is encouraging that type of behavior?
It is certainly true that the promotion of the shareholder value culture has done a great deal of damage. And the ranking which you describe was absolutely part of the culture at General Electric from 1980 on, created by Welch and others. And I think a lot of people, including people in the US federal government, would agree that this ranking strategy is an inappropriate way to proceed. That isn't inconsistent with the observation that there are a lot of people working in the public sector who are not doing their job very well, and the public sector might be better off without some of them.
And can I just ask about the role of the state? Because of course we are very much, seeing the Trump and Musk working closely together. We're seeing here the huge encouragement that the government is trying to make to businesses to invest a bit more in the UK by deregulating. What do you think all that will leave us with? Because you've got something very, very interesting here about we still have this belief in democracies and they are going to produce the right results, and that gives us a certain bias in accepting that the way things are happening now is perhaps the right way. And of course, we've seen some downsides to that as well. So how do you describe the role of the state in terms of ensuring that in fact the corporation of the 21st century does the right things, if you like, and also prospers, but not at the cost of leaving everyone else behind?
It's a complicated story, which we could certainly spend another or several evenings on. We're watching in Thames Water at the moment the kind of disaster that happens if you think you can simply pass responsibilities over to private companies with a well-defined regulatory framework. We need, and this is back to my basic premise, which is the purpose of large corporations is to run great businesses. That's what people did for years at ICI. It's what people did for years at General Electric, at Boeing, and so on. It's what people did at Marks and Spencer. And so someone gave me just a few weeks ago a book by an American. He was actually America's most successful football coach over a couple of decades. And it is The Score Takes Care of Itself. That's the way these things are. If you build great businesses, you create lots of shareholder value. And that's the way around it is. It is not that if you set out to maximize shareholder value, you build great businesses.
Indeed, but I mean, we spoke a little bit about the financial sector and bankers' bonuses, and there are some questions in the chat about this. And one of them is the concern that what goes on in the city is not really in any way interested in improving our well-being, but in fact, it's more in terms of making sort of individual profits. So with the city, having a really dismal record of real investment, and the primary focus, if you look at property and speculation, is really what the city is doing, money laundering. We've had all these books, of course, by Bullock as well, who wrote about the city being butler to the world through doing a lot of laundering of money coming in, particularly from originally Ukraine, but also Russia and elsewhere. So where does that leave a corporation which wants to be doing the right thing? Are they not still going to be subjected, whatever we think of shareholder value, to the pressures from the city to publish results quite regularly, and CEOs go because there's pressure from shareholders to split companies and increase shareholder value? I don't think any of that has disappeared. What do you think about
No,
this?
it hasn't disappeared, and it's in large part the source of our problem. That when we talked about what happened at ICI or Boeing or GE, a lot of it was that these organizations, which had operated largely with indifference to what was happening in financial markets, became financially dominated, and not to their best benefit, and not only not to their benefit, but not in the long run to the benefit of the shareholders themselves. That's what happened at Boeing, at General Electric, at ICI, at GEC in Britain, and so on. Companies that once they ceased to focus on building great businesses and became focused on making the numbers and building a better, sexier portfolio of businesses, engaging in what people in the city call corporate activity, which is basically mergers and acquisitions.
Yes.
And corporate activity is not actually making products that people want to buy. But that's what, as far as I'm concerned, real corporate activity is.
Well, I mean, I do remember Adair Turner writing of that property finance or property speculation in the city was just useless business, useless. Yes, I think he used a phrase like that. I can't remember. Perhaps you can remember, John. It was at the time of the financial crisis. But we have somebody commenting in the chat, Alicia Weston, saying that actually, companies that focus more on customer experience rather than sort of publicity, they are here still with us, whereas others who are engaged in all these fundraising and perhaps mergers and acquisitions are no longer with us. So perhaps the customer experience that one is talking about. Of course, I mean, customers do also want, at least we've always thought that they want to deal with companies which they can trust. And you do talk quite a lot about trust in the book. Can you say a little bit more about how that trust can actually develop and sustained? And I think we probably have to, take a couple more questions and close in a minute. So, John.
I think that observation is absolutely right. And the companies which have been most successful over the long term, the great companies of the 19th, 20th century, which have survived, have typically been companies in fast-moving consumer goods and areas like that, where the customer focus has been absolutely central to the business throughout. And these businesses, have been able to resist these kind of pressures to, as I say, manage a portfolio of businesses and make the numbers by a variety of accounting and other devices. So I think that's right. And
so the financial engineering that Peter Mandelson spoke about once with enthusiasm
is absolutely the opposite.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, Robin Stafford reminded us in the chat that it was indeed Adair Turner who called those activities as socially useless. Much of what the city does is socially useless. I think it was the expression that was used by Adair, which is interesting in itself. So just to focus again on the trust and how easy it is to lose it. And the Boeing is one example that you've given, but there are quite a lot of other companies too. But the German industry is quite interesting because it wasn't just whatever happened at Boeing, but where the Americans perhaps are to blame, but the Germans who in the car industry, they didn't give us the right information about the results of the tests they were doing on diesel cars and how, in fact, toxic they were. So there's a lot going on and has been going on. And what's really interesting for everybody, I mean, looking at this, the way in which you describe the company in the 21st century is what the lessons are about what types of companies will survive. Because here we are, huge monopolies, still all sorts of weird things going on. We have all sorts of things exposed in various firms that lead to the CEOs perhaps leaving. We have scandal after scandal. I mean, have we learned anything? And I'm going back to what I said about the state. And is the state doing enough in terms of regulating? Is the state doing enough in terms of breaking up monopolies? Is it doing enough? You mentioned the water industry in terms of ensuring that there is proper behavior and trust, because we probably have always been very untrusting of businesses, but this is probably one of the weakest points in that area, and the state must bear some responsibility for this.
I think what we need is not more regulation. In many ways, we need less regulation. What we need is more self-regulation. There's an example which it's one with which I begin with the book, which is the ludicrous case of Arkansas teachers versus Goldman Sachs. People who are listening to this call probably won't know or be interested in much of the detail of this, but the essence is that Arkansas Teachers Retirement Fund were one of a group of companies, a group of investors, suing Goldman Sachs on the grounds that they've invested in Goldman Sachs on the basis of Goldman Sachs' ethics statement. Their ethics statement begins and still begins, the client's interests always come first. What is breathtaking is that Goldman Sachs' defense to this case was not that the statement was true, but that the statement was so evidently not true. No reasonable person could have invested on the basis of that. And that's not just the defense which they put up. And they listed a whole series of disclosures of conflicts of interest, which were use anyone of the impression that the shareholders' interest, the client's interest really did come first. And that basically, that defense succeeded in the end. No wonder that trust is missing in business.
Yeah.
Back to the score takes care of itself. If you build great businesses, you build consumer trust, and that's an invaluable asset.
Yeah, but it may happen, it may work for some firms, but in general, I don't think we see that happening. So your call for less regulation agrees with what the government is thinking about doing now. But as people have been putting in the chat, I mean, in many cases, there are very few incentives for self-regulation if you can get away with things. And we do know that the service that one receives in various areas in various sectors is pretty poor. And it does require sort of cultural change within the organization. So you really think that this can all be done without the government necessarily sort of tightening up and, in fact, if anything, loosening in this area. And yet it's left us with big monopolies, it's left us with oligopolies, it's left us with a lot of profit making at the expense of consumers. We've seen that happening, and profiteering during the COVID crisis, the cost of living crisis, and everything else. I know it's a big question now, and we need to finish, but there is a concern in the chat that there's a lot of short-termism. So I just want to justify, if you can justify that you think that you really believe that because it makes good business sense to look after your customer, the companies will self-regulate.
Well, I think if they don't, we won't have good businesses and we won't have profitable businesses. I agree. That's the key point.
Yeah.
The key point is not that government should be making businesses better in this sense. The point is that the people running businesses should be making businesses better in this sense. And it's, to be honest, in my experience, that is what most of the people who are in business want to do. And the financial orientation which has been pressed on them by the growth of both the shareholder value culture and the financial sector of the last 50 years is not something that people who are successful in business really want to go along with. That is back to my story of the chief executive of my class, who came from a generation of people who understood that being chief executive was a responsibility. We've changed to a world in which, for a lot of people, it's a prize. And that's a change which is bad, not just for society as a whole, but for the businesses themselves. And that's the story of ICI and the story of Boeing and the story of there are other examples in the book, but we can go on proliferating.
Yeah. Okay, so it needs to be told again and again. And hopefully, through the MBA courses, through, all the business schools, through looking at examples, businesses may well behave that way. But we're still going to have a city that wants returns. Do you have any last comments, because Ben's face has suddenly appeared, to give us as words of optimism? You think that this will work by itself, the way we look at businesses differently, will lead to the results that we all want, a better functioning capitalist system?
Well, all I can do, Vicky, is write books setting out the value of doing this business, and slightly at least investing in businesses that understand these.
Yeah.
I can't change the culture on my own, but I can lay out the issues involved in what the culture needs to be and explain why it went so badly wrong. And that's what we need to put across on events like this, and MBA courses, in books, and there'll be more to come.
Thank you. There is another question which has finally appeared right at the end, which has now moved up in my chat. So it's about the automotive sector culture. I think we have already touched on it. So obviously it is worrying Derek Scott. He says, can you comment on the prevailing culture in, say, the automotive industry? which obviously he thinks is not amenable to what we've just been discussing. But you can say just one sentence, because you have looked at it as well, like everything else, and then we'll close. And John, anything you can say about the automotive sector, additionally to what we discussed already?
I can say about the automotive sector that this is what Alfred Sloan and his colleagues at General Motors actually wanted to do in the years before the Second World War, or through to the late 1940s. It's what in the end they failed to do, because the culture that was created in the United States in these firms was in the end less successful in producing cars that people wanted to buy than the more cooperative cultures that were developed in the Asian car producing industry.
Although we've seen some examples of not very good behavior in places like Japan.
We have, but it's nevertheless true that General Motors ceased to be the largest selling car producer in the world, and Toyota, which when General Motors was in its heyday, had never produced a single, or rather had never sold a single car outside Japan, became the largest producer of cars in the world. There's a lesson for people there.
Indeed. Well, it's fascinating. We could go on and on. As you were saying, we could just be discussing that and the role of the state for the next fortnight. But John, thank you very much indeed. That was really good. We've got some really good questions in the chat, and also I tried to incorporate some that I had received as well, particularly on ESG. So thank you for this, and I'll turn now to Ben.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, John. A really fascinating discussion. I know I tend to say this, and it's a real cliche, but we've only just scratched the surface. I would urge you to buy a copy of John's book, because I do feel that we are not necessarily able in an hour to do justice to his arguments. You'll see the link in the chat, and so please do take advantage of that. Secondly, put in your diaries now, or indeed you should be able to register any minute for our next webinar, which is with Julia Hobsbawm, talking about the future of work and the future of workplace and her new book. There you go. That's arrived in the chat as I speak, so that's great. Really exciting series of speakers we're getting at the moment, and that should be really worthwhile. Again, to repeat my previous messages from earlier webinars, everything we do is free. Please support us if you've enjoyed tonight. Support us by buying the books of the authors that we're able to attract. Support us also with a one-off donation, or by becoming a friend, which you can do via our website. If you'd gone to the cinema tonight, it would have cost you £10, £18 if you're in Leicester Square. We have significantly better value. So thank you for joining us for that. But also, I hope that people want to carry on this conversation. We carry a regular blog on our website. If you'd like to contribute to it, if you'd like to explain why John has misunderstood the nature of corporations in the 21st century, we'd be delighted to hear from you, and delighted to have you submit a blog for us. Finish just by saying thank you once more to John and Vicky. You made for a brilliant discussion, and thank you everyone for joining us, and good night.
And if anyone wanted to undo their whatever, the hidden cameras and wave hi to John and join me in an applause, then please do unmute yourselves as well, briefly, those who are still with us. So just to say thank you to John. Thanks very much.
John.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Discussion. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.